Right. So I'm the director of the Institute for Classics Education, Irini Allen, and just want to let you know we're a 501c3 nonprofit, and our mission is to provide free resources and support to educators who teach Homer and ancient Greek texts in English translation. And we strive to create an environment where everyone can come together and learn about and enjoy the classics. In addition to seminars like this one, we also run 12-week courses on the Iliad in the fall and the Odyssey in the spring. And we also develop new courses by request. So please don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have any questions about our programs or would like to request a program. I'll put my email in the chat box for your information. And today, I'm very happy to welcome Charlotte Spence. Charlotte is a PhD student at the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom, who will hopefully submit her thesis in May of this year. Her research focuses on the way in which ancient individuals conceived of the different roles of the dead and the divine in the creation of curse tablets. Alongside her primary research interests, Charlotte loves coinage and sharing the ancient world with as broad an audience as possible. So thank you so much for being here, Charlotte, and I will turn it over to you.
Oh, thank you so much, and thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to this. So I'm going to share my slides for you all, and yeah, I welcome as many questions as you want to ask at the end within our time constraints. So I'm going to talk to you about private religion in the ancient world today, primarily curse tablets, because that's my thing. So as Irini has said, I am a PhD student in the United Kingdom. And I focus on curse tablets, how ancient individuals conceived of the roles of the dead and the divine in curse tablets. And just at the bottom, there are a few little content warnings because some of these tablets can be a little bit gruesome. So some of them, there's allusions to rape and sexual violence. And then there is some allusions to physical abuse as well. So I just wanted to start off by talking to you all about kind of the role of religion in the ancient world a bit more generally. When we think of ancient Greece, we tend to think of fantastic temples, big festivals that process to these temples, things like the Olympic Games, chariot races at Delphi. So this would all kind of come under the umbrella of polished religion. This is religion that's sort of made up of elements that are organized by the state, and also festivals and things for the dead that are immediately within this kind of set geographic location. And then you've got Pan-Hellenic religion, which is kind of, as I said, the Olympic Games and kind of visiting the oracle at Delphi. And they're kind of religious rituals at religious sites that have this shared conception of what it meant to worship the ancient Greek gods. Then in the Roman world, you've kind of got this mixing of Roman ideas and more local ideas. So it's kind of this tension between global and local, really. So as the Roman Empire expands, the Roman pantheon expands with it, but you do get these mixing of different deities. So one of the ones we're going to talk about today is Sulis Minerva. And that's a combination of the Roman goddess Minerva and a Celtic goddess Sulis. And that happens in Bath in the United Kingdom. And across both the Greek and Roman worlds, we have this opportunity to directly interact with the gods as ancient individuals. So much like in the modern world, there's the offering of prayers. There's also the visiting of oracles in both ancient Greek and Roman religion. And there's this writing of curse tablets. So curses could be uttered orally, and we have examples in the Homeric epics and things like that. But this talk specifically is going to focus on the physical inscribing of a curse onto a written surface. So I hope that kind of situates what we're going to talk about a bit more. And these direct contact points with the gods, this is often described as personal religion or private religion. So let's start looking at what a curse tablet is. These are examples of rolled up curse tablets. So we find these curse tablets all around the Mediterranean. So in every single modern country surrounding the Mediterranean, and then also Germany and Portugal and Austria and the United Kingdom and Russia, Ukraine. So there's a huge geographical distribution of these tablets, which it's something that I kind of would like us all to keep in mind, that we're talking about a ritual that's undertaken quite privately and personally. It is all about that individual making their own choices based on their own lived experience. And it's their own feelings that have led to this moment. But at the same time, that's just one small point on this like huge continuum of history. So these tablets are made from the end of the 6th century BC. No, I hate putting an endpoint on it. I typically say to the end of the 6th century CE, but actually I think there might be an instance of one made on paper from the 9th century CE. So, but the point is you've got over 1,000 years of these things being produced, and like a huge geographical scale as well. So let's talk about this. What am I talking about when I say a curse tablet? We've seen them rolled up, which is fairly typical. They're like folded or rolled. Sometimes they're pierced, sometimes they're scrunched up, sometimes they're melted. So you can imagine that the state they get into by the time they kind of come to someone like me trying to read them. This is one of my favorite examples because it's not written in Greek and Latin. So I just would like to kind of break out of that thought process. The ancient world, there's more than Greek and Latin. We've got Celtic curses. We've got one like this that's written in Punic. And it's on the left-hand side of my screen, so hopefully it is for you guys. But we've got an image of what this curse tablet actually looks like. It was originally a photograph, and it's kind of been messed around with the exposure and things so that we can see the writing on it. And you can see that it's a bit of a pickle trying to pick out some of these letters. And then we've got the reproduced text, and then we've got a translation. So here we've got an ancient individual so this is like the 3rd century BC. It's deposited in a tomb that's from the 7th century. So that's very interesting in itself. And we've got this instance of some individual who's writing to Hawat, who's a like Phoenician goddess, and they're saying that they want their victim to be melted. And because she has rejoiced at my expense about the money I've lost completely, may you cause them to melt, and every person who rejoices at my expense about the loss of money. So I think when we just read this text, we immediately get a sense of, there's some shame, there's some embarrassment that's caused this. But, in the modern world, we might turn to our friends and be like, oh my God, I can't believe that they're laughing at my embarrassment. But someone's gone through this ritual action of sourcing a piece of lead, ensuring it's flat enough, inscribing their curse on it, rolling it up, and then taking it to a necropolis to deposit it in a grave as a point to try and convene with the gods. And I think that's really interesting. And when I say it like that, I'm struck by how different it is to our kind of modern conceptions of how we would engage with divine powers. But at the same time, we totally understand, we share this sense of like guilt and shame and embarrassment that can come up in everyday interactions. So there is a proper definition, and I thought I'd provide it for you all. David Jordan was like the godfather of curse tablet publication and analysis. So if you are interested in curse tablets, his name will come up a lot. And so in 1985, he described curse tablets, and defictiones is the Latin for them, and they're called katadesmoi in Greek. So defictiones, more commonly known as curse tablets, are inscribed pieces of lead, usually in the form of small thin sheets, intended to influence by supernatural means the actions or welfare of persons or animals against their will. So this is like the emphasis on supernatural means is key here. So Jordan expands this later on in 2001. So curse tablets can be written on papyrus, lead, marble, bits of slate, bits of selenite, so it's kind of a rock crystal that gleams in the light. You get them on wax, you get them on bits of paper, as I said, so they can be on anything. But most of the ones we're going to talk about today are lead, because lead just survives better in the archaeological record. And also, historically, it's been assumed curse tablets are on lead, so those that aren't have sometimes been excluded or mislabeled as amulets, which does make me laugh. There's some written on silver that have been classified as amulets, but they're causing for like massive destruction. And you're like, that's not quite got the protective nature we would expect from an amulet. So we know what curse tablet is. But we need to kind of keep in mind that it's all about this supernatural power. So these tablets, they're intending to access help from otherworldly powers, such as the gods or the restless dead. So this is an important distinction again. You can appeal directly to the gods, or you can appeal to this special group called the restless dead. And this is an ancient Greek idea that someone who dies before their time, someone who dies by violence, someone, typically women who die before they're married, and somebody who doesn't get proper burial rites becomes a part of this special group of the restless dead. And this is really interesting because I think all of them give this sense of like incompleteness, or their life hasn't been like fulfilled to its true potential. So there's this sense of power that's not yet been spent. And that would probably explain why they're viewed as powerful in this context. There's also the use of magical symbols, which are sometimes invoked like powers, but also sometimes just used to kind of improve the power of the curse. But there's also this idea of sympathetic magic. So piercing a tablet because you want the victim to be like stuck, like you would stick the tablet with a nail. And then in this example, which is from Attica from the 3rd century BC, we've got, just as this lead is cold and passionless, so in the same way, let the words and deeds and tongue of those inscribed here be cold and passionless in a law court. So this is quite typical in ancient Athens. This is a curse against a legal dispute. And as you can imagine, based on all our like knowledge of how litigious Athens was, it makes sense that there are curses being made in this law court context. So we've got this idea of like different ways of engaging with the powers that could be invoked. So the gods, the restless dead, and then this more kind of nebulous group of magical signs and named daemones. So there's like kind of other intermediary powers. But curse tablets are typically written, there are like 6 groups, apologies. So you've got erotic magic, so those about trying to track down a husband or a wife, or trying to steal someone else's wife, either because they're a love interest or for a more casual encounter. And these can be written by men against women, by women against men, by men against men, by women against women. So that's really interesting as a kind of point of diversity in the ancient world. And also there's 2 groups. So there's those that are trying to separate people. So don't let so-and-so come near my husband. And those that are trying to bring people together. So drag this particular person to my bed. So that's really cool. And most of those are from kind of North Africa, so Egypt, Carthage, that kind of region. Then we've got legal spells like the one I've just shown you, which are just typically to do with issues in law courts, binding the tongues of witnesses, things like that. Competition curses, which are against like foot races, chariot races. And these are, again, more often from North Africa, but often there's an example that we'll see. So they curse the horses and the charioteers themselves. This next group, prayers for justice. This is a little bit controversial because some people think that they're not proper curse tablets because they're not about binding a victim. They're about asking the gods to punish a victim. But they're still calling for this like outcome of the victim being cursed by the power of the gods. So I kind of think they should be included in this. And to exclude them means that you end up with a lot of tablets that are kind of in a grey area. So lots of these are from Rome and Britain. So we'll look at some of those from Bath a bit later on. You've got business curses that are sort of about, often about taverns. So curse so-and-so so they lose their customers, which is pretty mean, but very interesting. Or curse so-and-so so their pot's smashed in the oven, in the kiln, apologies. And then you've got some miscellaneous tablets where we can't really identify what they're about, either because it's not stated or because they're like terribly fragmented. And I'd just like to say that these are categories that help us understand what's going on, but they don't actually kind of impact the decision making that goes into the creation of a tablet. They all kind of echo the same formula and things like that. So this I've included, and I kind of thought you might want to read it in your own time with the slides being sent out beforehand. There's really not much literary evidence for curse tablets. The earliest is Plato, who talks about beggar priests offering to sell curses to rich men. But this is the only instance we've got where there's a description of curse tablets actually being used. And as you can see, there's this idea that the skin has become the same kind of color as the curse tablets. And it's about like how they brought about the death of Germanicus. So the lack of literature on curses is interesting, because you've got Pliny claiming that there's no one that does not fear to be cursed, and yet no one else is really writing about it or talking about it. Is that because the people producing the literature are kind of more enfranchised and therefore have other recourses for help and are less likely to engage with the creation of curse tablets? Is it because there's a snobbery? Is it because there's a shame? Or is it also because the literature that does discuss these kind of slightly irrational and weird things that the ancients are doing just haven't survived through the manuscript tradition? So all these questions are quite interesting. So now that's like kind of the end of the background introductory stuff. Let's have a look at some examples, and I'm really excited to share these with you. So this one is from the very early 4th century BC Attica, and I absolutely love it because this would fall into that miscellaneous category, but it's described as a counter curse. So it's inscribed on 2 sides. The actual thing is quite big. It's very fragmentary now. They don't tend to survive very well once they've been unrolled. So side A starts with, if anyone has cursed me, whether woman or man, slave or free, or stranger or citizen, or household member or stranger, from envy of me, my work and deeds. If anyone has cursed me in the presence of Hermes Erykthonos, or the presence of Hermes the binder, or in the presence of Hermes the trickster, or elsewhere, curse in turn all my enemies. And then on side B, almost as an afterthought, there's like, oh, also curse my court opponent. And I love this because this echoes what I was saying about Pliny. He says there's no one that doesn't fear to have been cursed. This is someone who fears they've been cursed. So when people say to me, oh, did cursing actually work? If you believe that you could be cursed, then it works, you know? Psychologically, lots of the kind of punishments that are called upon you, so sleeplessness, a lack of appetite, you know, you can cause all those things. You can think yourself ill, you can stress yourself out to the point where those outcomes actually occur. So I thought this was a great one to start with, but also remember this phrase, whether man or woman, whether slave or free, because we're talking about the 4th century BC here in ancient Greece, but it's going to appear again much later on, which is another interesting kind of rabbit hole that I'm going to take you down. So we've gone from ancient Athens to this other interesting ancient Greek text. So we've jumped forward a couple of centuries. We're now in the 2nd century BC. We're now on Amorgos. And I love this text. This is the Greek for your own time to have a look at. But in English, you've got this curse. It's addressed to Demeter. And it starts with, I am your supplicant. I fall before you as your slave. And it goes on to all of these issues. You know, the guy that's being targeted by the curse, the victim of the curse, has taught this chap's slaves evil ways. He's put ideas into their head. He's given them advice. He's seduced them. He has laughed at me. So I really like this because it feels like it's filled with teenage angst. It's like almost like a diary entry of, this is everything that's gone wrong in my life. No one understands me. And at one point he describes himself as being completely alone, and then also mentions the suffering of his wife. So although he's not like physically isolated, you get this palpable sense of the feeling of isolation that has driven this individual to create a curse tablet and address it to the goddess. And I think that's a really interesting point for us to consider. You know, why are people creating them? Is it because they have no one else to turn to? Like, quite possibly, which I think is really cool. So my next lot, these are again dedicated to Demeter. This is a particular sanctuary. And what's really cool about this sanctuary is the fact that there is an annual festival of all the women that come together and process to the sanctuary. And this particular text, so this is DT4, and DT is just its like reference number. DT stands for Difficzione Tabelle. And this one was catalogued in 1904. So our 2 big corpus of curse tablets were published in 1897 and 1904. And then lots of them got lost. So we are dealing with some really, really old, really tricky to read printed material, or we're dealing with inscribed lead that's also tricky to read. But this one, it's found along with 12 others. It's in this corner of the sanctuary where it's just been kind of brushed aside as rubbish. But this is really interesting. So it starts with, I dedicate to Demeter and Persephone, the man who spoke against me, that I made poisons for my husband. May he come to the temple of Demeter burning along with all his allies or family and publicly confess, and may he not meet with mercy from Demeter or Persephone and the other gods with Demeter. But let there be a life of purity and freedom under the same roof, and whether I have dealings with him in any way. I dedicate also the man who has written accusations against me or directed another man to accuse me. Do not let him find Demeter or Persephone or the gods with Demeter merciful, but let him burn and come before Demeter with his allies and family. So what's really interesting here is that this is a crime punishable by death. You know, if this lady is found guilty of attempting to poison her husband, that is the outcome. She will be punished in that way. But she has no recourse to other legal action. She can't present a counter case in a law court. So what does she do? She's turned to Demeter. She's produced this curse tablet. And what's really interesting about this tablet and this cache of others is the fact that they look like they've been publicly displayed. And normally curse tablets are thrown into graves or into wells or deposited at sanctuaries. So here, if you think about what I was just saying with being able to think yourself poorly, is that if you see this curse and you know you're responsible for this kind of pain, then you might end up thinking yourself poorly. You might suddenly find, oh, am I feeling a bit feverish? And how do you rectify that? Do you make offerings to the goddess? Do you resolve it with the person who's created the curse and they get to take the curse tablet down? You know, this one tablet is really illustrative of a wider social context and wider social network. How are these people interacting with each other, knowing that they could potentially curse each other? And I'd also like to use this point to emphasize the fact that a woman has written this. So this is like a direct piece of evidence from a kind of more marginalized group in our sources, which leads me seamlessly to a tablet that's written much, much later. This is the Temple of Isis and Magna at Mainz. So we're in modern Germany now. And this one's dated to just into like AD or CE, the Common Era. So between 70 and 130 CE. And this tablet says, I entreat you, Mistress Marta Magna, to avenge me regarding the goods of Florus, my husband. So we've got another curse written by another woman. Let's think about what that means for the narrative that we have been told about literacy rates in the ancient world. Like all these curse tablets that have been written by lots of normal people with varying levels of handwriting and spelling kind of, I think, should illustrate to us that we have a much broader spectrum of literacy than we would expect, illiterate versus illiterate, but also groups typically have been led to kind of think as being more illiterate, less well educated. They are capable of writing like fairly complex text. My favorite thing about this is that it's probably written by of her inheritance from her husband, but she would have no legal recourse. Again, there is no way that she could recover that money. So she's turned to the goddess. And her desire is that the victim of this curse, this Alatus Severus, goes as salt melts in water, so may it happen to him. Like, goodness me. She's asking for the vengeful nature of the goddess to avenge this kind of theft or this defrauding. But the outcome she's asking for seems to be for the victim to literally melt. And I have no answer for you on what that actually means. But it's really interesting, isn't it, that that is an appropriate thing to ask of a goddess in her sanctuary setting. And I think the deposition of these tablets must have been a bit more public because they were thrown into a flame on a sacred altar, not the main altar, but it's more in the back corner of the temple. But everyone would see you going there. Everyone would see you throwing something in there. So even if they don't know what's actually a cursed tablet itself, they know what you've done. So it's a personal act, yes. It's kind of carried out in private. The inscription on these tablets was probably private. Yet again, this social network is involved and people know, and you can just imagine, oh, well, I saw so-and-so and they were throwing a curse tablet and also watch out, I wonder what's happening. You know, it's a real insight into this kind of, this side of the ancient world that we don't get to experience very often. So I've kind of said issues of ancient literacy. These texts are being produced by professionals sometimes by normal people. all the examples we've looked at have had quite bad handwriting, so are probably produced by normal people. But there's these two groups of curse tablets, literary ones and vernacular ones. And this is an instance of a more literary one. So it's inscribed in Greek. And as you can see at the top here, there's these weird lines and dots that are being used to make symbols. These are these magical signs I was talking about before. So sometimes they're invoked as powers in their own right, and sometimes they're added just to make it more magical. And this is another instance of things being produced by a professional. We've got a set of 26 of these. They slot like Russian dolls. So you get the smallest one in the middle, then the medium in the biggest one, and then they're sealed. And these are all written in the same handwriting. They're all from a similar date. So they're probably produced by a professional as well. And my favorite thing about this image is you can just about see on the smallest one, above the figurine, that's actually a fingerprint. So we've got an ancient fingerprint that survives, and it's a small fingerprint. So forensic analysis suggests that it's the fingerprint of a woman. So again, we've got this really interesting thing. This professional that was supposedly creating these curse tablets is described as he all the way through our earliest scholarly literature. Then someone analyzes this fingerprint and everyone goes, oh, okay. Are there individuals making them then? Or maybe it's actually a professional woman making these things. But this is what I really love about it. We kind of don't have answers to this, but we're cracking open some of these really long-held, almost Victorian assumptions about the roles of different people in the ancient world, which just is so cool to me. So this is a little thing that I thought you might also like to have a read of in your own time. Graham does some really interesting work on making sure that we remember these are ancient people making their own decisions, but they're engaging perhaps with a professional in this situation. So I just thought I'd include this for you as a bit of a kind of bibliographical background reading that you might want to return to. The last bit of this talk, I'm going to talk about the Roman baths at Bath. This is kind of what it looks like now. Most of it is medieval, but the bath itself and the bottom of these pillars are Roman, and it's kind of the same layout as it would be in Roman times. Apologies. So this is Roger Tomlin's. These are Roger Tomlin's words. Roger Tomlin, you know, I said like David Jordan is like a big deal in curse tablets. Roger Tomlin is, again, he's up there. He's like the grandfather of curse tablets, and he is responsible for the production of our catalogues of the British curse tablets. So his ability to make out crazy tiny Latin handwriting with all the letters written backwards is unbelievable. He's literally a magician, I think, to be able to figure it out. But he says, that an author was what was expected of him. But like a Roman with a will, the document was emphatically his own invention. Now, this is really interesting because we've got over 200 tablets from Bath, provincial place. The Roman Empire is kind of crumbling around Bath at this point. So we're talking about the 4th century. Not one of them is written by the same person. So we've got no professional there. We've got no priest there that's making them. They're all written by different people, which is just so interesting to me. So keep in mind that this is what a more literary text would look like. This is, again, an example of a literary text. Oh, I think my slides have come out, it doesn't matter. So this is a chartier text from Rome. Again, we've got these like magical symbols, we've got drawings, and this is one which is all about causing the blue team to kind of take victory. The blue team to lose their victory. So it's awesome. And also it includes some of the names of the horses as well, but make him headless, footless, and powerless. Just some of them are just hilarious, aren't they? Again, a charioteer curse, again, from a similar date, but this one is from Carthage, and it's from the grave of a Roman official. And inside this grave, there were 12 other curse tablets. So this poor chap was either a particularly useful and powerful member of the restless dead, or maybe he had an offering tube, because we have Carthaginian offering tubes that have grills on the top to stop people putting curse tablets down them, which I think is brilliant in itself. You know, people are aware that there is this risk of how their like deceased relative might end up being used. And around the edge of this one, I think is quite interesting because you've got these weird signs again. So this is carefully planned, isn't it? And the handwriting on this particular tablet is immaculate. So again, probably a professional. And this one's also against a particular charioteer of the blues. So you bind every limb and every sinew, and it kind of lists, well, if you can't do this, make sure this happens, like blind their eyes so they can't see, twist their soul and heart so it can't be. And this one includes this weird sympathetic magic that I was talking about. So just as this rooster has been bound by its feet, hands and head, so bind the legs and hands and head and heart of victorious. So again, there's almost this sense of, you know, kind of Haitian voodoo with voodoo dolls that impact on the victim. There's some similar conception of action having an impact going on there as well, which is pretty cool. And here is one final one in this series. Again, you've got this possible horse-headed demon. It looks like you've got the bound victim. And this one is interesting because, as you can see, a third of the way down, it says spell. So this suggests it's been copied and someone hasn't quite understood that you don't need the description of what comes next to be copied out as well. And that in itself raises interesting questions. We've got some magical handbooks that survive from Egypt, but not many. And that's probably because papyrus and parchment and paper don't survive well. So even if they're copied outside of the ancient world, they won't have come down to us from like the wet climes of Northern Europe. But there is no surviving spell that matches this one, which is interesting. So is there some kind of innovation, or is it just that we've lost it? And that's kind of the big question with curse tablets. Did it exist? Is it interesting that it's not included? Or is it an archaeological accident or an accident of preservation? And that can be very, very frustrating. So apologies, we've gone around the houses a bit, but we've come back to Bath. So this one is cool. This is just 9 names, but I love it because in this photograph, you can see how neat that handwriting is. So what does that mean? I've just told you that none of them are produced by the same person. So do we have like a particularly literate individual in this case? It seems so. You know, it's just a list of names of people to be cursed by the goddess. And this happens quite a lot. I'd say the majority of our tablets are just lists of names. So it must be important to inscribe them and have that physical ritual action of depositing their names in a grave, or in this situation, in a sacred spring. So you're kind of handing over the victim to the gods in that kind of physical way, because the name is a part of a person. You know, knowing someone's name gives you some control over them. This one again is a list of names, and there are more interesting examples that we're going to get to, but this is on a pewter plate. So I just think this really nicely emphasizes the fact that this is seen as a legitimate way of engaging with legitimate deities. And spare bits of pewter are quite freely available around Bath because of the production of such things nearby. But this individual has chosen to use a plate and fold it in quarters and deposit it. So again, a slightly different interaction with the gods, a slightly different way to how we would engage with the gods. This one I love because it's about the loss of 2 silver coins. And the punishments ask for are you are not to permit him, so the victim, to sit or lie or to walk or have sleep or health, and you are to consume him as soon as possible. So again, this picture gives you a nice idea of how tricky these texts are to engage with, but this is quite a small loss, 2 silver coins. But the punishment that's being called for is enormous. But you can see in those things listed that lots of those things could be psychosomatic. And if you have stolen these coins, then, you know, you could probably think yourself into that kind of state. Now, this one again is a loss of 6 silver coins. Interestingly, when they excavated the sacred spring, or the great drain of the baths, I should say, they found lots and lots of coins and lots of rings. So maybe lots of the people creating these curse tablets accidentally lost them rather than having them stolen. But we've got all these curse tablets, so they were obviously very upset about it. So this one again just deals with 6 silver coins. You've got a list of potential victims. But remember that phrase that we talked about from the 4th century in ancient Greece. 4th century BC in ancient Greece. This one starts with, whether pagan or Christian, whomsoever, whether man or woman, whether boy or girl, whether slave or free. And this formula is found in quite high densities in Bath and in Uli, which is another place in Britain, but also elsewhere on curse tablets. So you've got this shared formula. I've told you that none of the tablets at Bath are written by the same person, so there's not professional involvement in their creation. But how are these ideas spreading? Is it just a case of individuals understanding, as Roger Tomlin suggests, how to go about it? But also this inclusion, apologies, of whether pagan or Christian is really interesting. So it's Su Gentilis, Su Christianus. Do we have a sense then of a group that identify themselves as Christian versus another group? Does that other group identify themselves as pagan? You know, what kind of questions could we possibly answer from this? I mean, it's quite limited, but the fact that it's included on an ancient inscription from like the 4th century from Bath illustrates that we've got this kind of pagan practice carrying on, and we've got this idea that this pagan goddess, Sulis Minerva, who could have an impact on 2 separate groups who don't share the same beliefs. And I think that's very interesting. We have later curse tablets from Rome that include Jesus Christ as an invoked power. So we do end up with Christian curse tablets. But here we've got this casual inclusion of whether pagan or Christian. And I think that's just a really interesting point. We've already got something weird going on in Bath, but this is just giving us, again, this insight into a culture and a community that we wouldn't normally have access to. This is an interesting example again. I told you they would get more interesting. This is a sanction against perjury. So the names who have sworn, and there's like 12 of them, at the spring of the goddess Sulis on the 12th of April, whoever has perjured himself there, you are to make him pay for it to the goddess Sulis in his own blood. So this is not a typical curse tablet, but it illustrates to you that this is like a personal way of communicating with the gods in some senses, or in some instances. And yet here, in this case, there's been obviously a group of individuals. They've had this, like, they've sworn an oath in the presence of Sulis Minerva, and they've created this curse tablet. So this becomes a conditional curse, because if they haven't perjured themselves, nothing bad will happen. But if they have, then they're calling down the power of the goddess upon themselves. So a very interesting way of engaging with the gods here. You know, is it about kind of finding help in situations where you wouldn't have any other recourse? But perjury is something that's punishable by law in ancient Rome. So is it the case that Roman Britain, already a bit peripheral, Roman Bath, a bit provincial, they don't have access to the same kind of judicial systems as elsewhere? Or is it that this is seen as like a particularly powerful way of bringing down the power of the goddess and engaging with the gods and adding an emphasis to this kind of important moment? And here, just as like one of my final points, this is, well, as you can see, there are no letters we can make out on this. So it's described as a pseudo inscription by Roger Tomlin. And this is written by someone who's illiterate. And we've got a few instances of this. We've got, these are labeled 112 to 116 in his big catalogue, but there are potentially a lot more. It's just quite tricky to ascertain whether something is meant to be a letter, but someone's a bit illiterate or not got the best handwriting, or whether it's just a copying of the process of writing. But there's these instances where someone has inscribed a tablet, they folded them and they've thrown them in the sacred spring. So they've followed every possible ritual step, but the inscription itself makes no sense because they can't write. So that, I think, to me illustrates how important the physical ritual of the creation of a curse tablet is, but also illustrates an understanding of the potential power of the goddess. She's going to know what you mean. And I think in all of these examples I've shown you that there would have been an oral invocation of the gods as well. So would there be a prayer, or is it just a reading aloud of the text? And if we think back to the example I showed you where it says spell in the middle, so someone's clearly copied it out, does that suggest that the first bit's meant to be spoken and the second bit inscribed? You know, so there's got to be this sense of kind of a multifaceted way of engaging with the gods. So some thoughts to conclude on. We've got curse tablets being produced across a huge geographical and chronological scope. We've got individuals who are isolated from other means of help. We've got individuals who are traditionally disenfranchised. So you've got tablets by women, tablets by slaves, those kind of individuals. We've got ancient religion and ritual as a multi-leveled thing. So you've got kind of polis level engagement, you've got your personal engagement, and then you've got Panhellenic, or if you're in the Roman world, like Roman pantheonic engagement with different powers. And then just this idea of the study of private or personal religion gives us insight into groups who are normally less visible, or aspects of society that are perhaps less well understood. And then I've just included on the last slide some things that you might want to follow up with. So Cursed Tablets and Binding Spells from the Ancient World. It's published in 1992, so it's a little bit of an old book, but it's still like a touchstone for an introduction to these texts. They're all presented in translation with some commentary. And then Magic, Witchcraft and Ghosts in the Greek and Roman worlds. That includes Cursed Tablets, but other literary sources and things. So it's a really nice introduction to this kind of broader magic versus personal religion thing. And Kiernan's Dick Cursed Tablets work is really interesting. He talks about that psychosomatic stuff that I've kind of brought up briefly. So that's the end of my talk. I hope you all enjoyed it. It was a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I apologize, but I hope you enjoyed it.
I thought it was fantastic and appreciate that scope of everything that you covered. It's really thought-provoking. I also really love the connections that you make to the emotional element and how that can become a factor. We don't often think about that. And I do love the way that we're invited to really humanize and maybe avoid some of those generalizations. And on a personal level, I also really, it's very exciting to see these products of women's writing as well, because as you said, there are a lot of Victorian assumptions that I think have burrowed into our interpretive framework, and we sort of need to untangle those, I think, in many areas of study of the ancient world. But we still have time, so if anybody has questions, any thoughts or questions for Charlotte, we can take them now.
Because some of the women were literate, at least some, if not all, who wrote them were literate, would that have necessarily meant that they were of a certain level, class?
What a good question. I mean, in that example I showed you from the Temple of Martyr Magna, maybe if she's worried about the money that's been left to her by her dead husband, that suggests that there's sort of enough money for it to be of concern. But I don't think so. I think particularly the issues that are brought up in the tablets from the Temple of Demeter at Cnidus, they're quite broad ranging, and none of them are like would indicate that they're like particularly powerful or wealthy women that have raised these issues. It's very tricky because we can ascribe a lot of meaning to, or a lot of our own interpretations to these objects, but at the end of the day, they are mute beyond the actual inscription. So I think it's fair to assume that literacy levels across the Mediterranean in the ancient world are higher than we would think. And I would say that, you know, probably lots of fairly low kind of social class women could reach the point of maybe identifying their own name, or being able to read an inscription, or being able to write their own name, or being able to write a simple sentence. Lots of people, when they start to do the Latin of these texts with me, go, oh, this is just really bad Latin. I'm like, it is. I mean, it is. The spelling is not standardized. You know, the understanding the grammar is not what we would think of as like being able to speak Latin, but they could. So yeah, that was a really long answer to a question. I'm so sorry. But
no, that's fine. But when you say different, it'd be like say you've read Wuthering Heights, Joseph. That's not standard English.
Yeah. And I think because the way we learn ancient languages, we are introduced to this idea of like, this is how you spell this Greek word, this is how the accusative works. But like in 4th century Latin handwritten text, the M at the end of the accusatives is just dropped off. Like it's almost an irrelevant at that point. And this idea of like vulgar Latin, it comes to the fore. And there's a really interesting project going on with the tablets in England, where Roger Tomlin is he's tracking like different words and phrases that have been spelt how they sound, but spelt differently. So these ideas are being shared orally. That's kind of his hypothesis. So if you've got non-standard Latin as well, that throws some really interesting variations in spelling in. So yeah, this variation, our version of like standardized spelling and learning, just you've kind of got to leave that at the door when you're trying to translate these texts. So yeah, it's a really good analogy you've drawn. Thank you.
Well, one thing, then I'll shut up for a while. As they seem to be appealing to Demeter quite a lot, would that have anything to do with the mystery cults?
I think so. I think I've accidentally like influenced your opinion. So the most common god that's invoked is Hermes, which would make sense as his kind of in-betweeny nature. But Demeter is up there. I think she's probably in the top 10. These are like this is an archaeological issue as well, because Sulis Minerva is like one of the most common, just because we've got a lot of tablets from one place that invoke her. But yes, I think there's probably something to do with mystery cults. And also I think there's probably something to do with her links to Persephone, and that gives her like a liminal nature as well. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. There's something in the chat. There are similar aspects to inscriptions or documents from Mesopotamia, Persia, and South Asia. They might not be cursed tablets as such, but they contain names who were to benefit, invocations to gods, but also warnings to those who might cause some destruction to a monument or donation. Interesting.
There are some really interesting, there's some really interesting curses that don't technically come under my kind of curse tablet remit, but they curse people if they would commit like violence to a grave monument or something like that. And I think there is some quite good literature on the fact that that's something that comes into particularly into the Roman Empire from like things that have been experienced in the Near East. As you've got that expansion of the Roman Empire eastwards, you have that transfer of ideas back into the West. But I do think the origins of curse tablets is really weird. Our earliest examples come from Sicily, and then they seem to travel to ancient Athens, and then they seem to travel back to Italy and kind of the Italian mainland. But they like seem to spring fully formed. The earliest tablets are really long, they're complicated. Some of them are round and written in a spiral. So there's not really this development of there's a list of names, then there's a list of names and the god invokes, then there's a list of names and what you want to happen to them, then there's the long complicated ones. So I think the fact that they spring fully formed into the archaeological record illustrates we are missing a big like early step between spoken, possibly like spoken curses like we see in the Homeric epics, to fully formed things. So I think, and often that's like spread of knowledge from east to west is really interesting in religious things. So yeah, it's a really good point. And I think it's a case of like, watch this space. It could be very exciting what we find out as we go forward.
Yeah, and as you mentioned,
I can add to that actually a little bit. Yeah, so I mean, they have in like religious texts. So for example, in early Hindu texts in the Vedas, there's one section, that Atharva Veda, which is purely like magical kind of invocations, or even you can kind of consider them as curses as well. They invoke a particular god to either benefit the person or to punish, for causing certain problems to a person. But then this kind of gets carried forward into Buddhism, where there are these special like protective formulae where people can invoke the gods to help them as well for something, or again to like punish people for committing like witchcraft against them, or to protect them from demons and things like that. So I think there's potentially a religious element as well, like which is an oral tradition to begin with, but then it becomes written at some point, and people draw on those ideas in their documents or inscriptions.
Yeah, this is really interesting, and I definitely think there's links that should be pursued, and I think that's what's really nice when we start to be like a bit more interdisciplinary. Instead of just staying in our ancient world bubble, we start to think actually these ancient people interacting across oceans, across mountains, across land masses. But it also raises the question for me, how much is like shared human consciousness of experience, and how much is like cause and relation. And I think that's, when I read some of these texts, I feel like I understand the emotional impetus that caused them to be created. So that's like a shared human consciousness. But as you say, I think there's got to be more solid links there between what's going on around the Mediterranean and what's going on more across the Eurasian continent as a whole, to be honest.
And I think when you think about the links between the Hellenistic world and South Asia, because of Alexander and his legacy as well, so there's that potential for ideas to travel. But I think there's also, this is human nature, and everyone's always worried about, oh, this person's giving me the evil eye. Yeah, I think things can happen independently as well.
Yeah, thank you. And it's a really interesting point that's been made in the chat about this like ceremony from Hong Kong. That's really cool. I didn't know about that. I know about Japanese, I think they're cursing trees where you like go and hang a curse, but yeah, I didn't know about that. Thank you.
Yeah, and when you mentioned the spoken, I thought of in Gilgamesh as well, when Enkidu talks about cursing the doors.
Oh yes.
The wood, yeah. So there's something shared. I mean, there's so many shared things with, of course, the Homeric epics and
also in the Judeo-Christian tradition, there's the Psalms. Many of the Psalms call on God to destroy the enemy and save the person who's faithful to God. And even today, a lot of people in Israel, there are people who believe in the hand that saves them from the evil eye, and they commonly wear this on their necklaces, this metal hand to save them from the evil eye. I think that there are a lot of people that are superstitious to this day. And they, I don't know if they engage in personal curses that way, but I recall one particular incident where typically rooms in institutions have a little symbol there. It's a mezuzah. It's called a mezuzah, a symbol of the Ten Commandments. And a religious person normally kisses it this way before entering the room. And one time I was at college, and one of the professors who was religious and wearing a kippah entered the room without kissing the mezuzah. And one of the students saw him do it and said, how can you do that? You know what that's going to do to you? And he said, I believe in God, but I don't believe in magic. So I thought that was quite interesting. But I think that there are a lot of people today who, they have, I even find myself fighting sometimes this idea of certain numbers that are, supposed to have a certain effect, like 7 or 13. But I dismiss it because I just reject the idea of superstition. But I think it's something that the human condition is prone to. So
I think that need for control does sort of brings perhaps superstition a bit more to the fore sometimes, doesn't it? If you can avoid certain numbers in an attempt to control bad things. But you've kind of caught me red-handed in my avoidance of the entire magic versus religion debate, because I am a coward and I skirt around that like pool of possible terror. I say, oh well, some people think it's magic, but it could be personal religion. Let's talk about curse tablets. So slightly rumbled there.
And Sarah,
yeah, Keith Thomas wrote about this in a fairly famous history book. Can't remember the exact title. I think it's the history of magic in the Western world, something like that. Can't remember the exact title, but Keith Thomas I think you can easily Google it.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very kind. Thank you. I'll write that down.
Sarah, you wanted to ask something as well. Thank you, Eli.
Yeah, I wanted to, first of all, of course, thank Charlotte. I'm a teacher, a high school teacher of ancient Greek and Latin. And I think my kids would be very interested in those informations because, as you wrote also, it gives us insight into an ancient world that doesn't have any voice in the school manuals. For example, yesterday I was talking about Vindolandia, you know, the letters.
Yes.
They were surprised, like the graffiti also from Pompeii. So this is a day life and the fears of ancient people that make students feel very close to this world, much more than rules, grammar rules, or other things that they have to learn. So first of all, thank you very much, Charlotte, because you gave me an idea. Then I wanted to say also some more. Of course, from India, from the East, comes every kind of wisdom. So, of course, and as Irini also said, Gilgamesh, and then I think Greek people took from when they colonized the Asia Minor coast, they there learned many things about from Orient. But I wanted to say also, first a question, I think you already said that, were you afraid to work on study this kind of tablets? And I mean, there is a kind of suggestion, do you say suggestion also?
Yes, I mean, and this is a superstitious thing. I don't tend to read them aloud in the ancient Greek or in the Latin in full, which sounds silly, but I think did they work? I don't know, but I've got that kind of overthinking brain where I think, oh, did I? What have I unleashed into the world?
They have their own strength, of course, of course. I thought the same. And I was looking at, of course, the Greek verbs, because katadesmi is the cures. And katedesen, that means he tied me down. So katadeo, that means I keep you downstairs under the world. And this is also why many of these cures come from the sanctuaries of Dimitra and Persephone, of course. And the last, and then I shut up. Many deficciones or curses, okay, come also from Magna Grecia. I come from there, from Locri, Epizephiri. So I will write you down some bibliography about someone who studied these deficciones that are, of course, from the sanctuary of Demetra and Persephone. So
yes, I would love that. Thank you.
You will. Of course, from Keramikos in Athens, there are many. I guess you know already. Yeah. Thank you. And that was really brilliant. And I wish you every luck, even though you study on cures.
Thank you. Yeah, I might need it. Thank you. Keep me safe.
And Robin also has a hand up.
Oh, thank you. I think you mentioned with some of the early tablets, it can be hard to work out whether the person is doing the curse themselves or calling on a deity to do it.
Yes.
I think that confusion has persisted throughout history. If you look even at the Catholic Church in recent centuries, you have form, matter, and intent for a sacramental act. But the use of language is always as if the person is doing it. You say the bishop ordained the priest, rather than the bishop called on God to ordain the priest.
Yes.
So I think there's a natural tendency to slip some religious acts into a slightly magical context.
Yes. Yes, and I agree. And lots of these kind of curses do just go I bind. So is there a sense of the ritual action brings about the end result, or is it the case that you're binding through the power of the gods that you're engaging with? You know, it becomes very complicated, very messy. And there's this idea of sympathetic magic, there's the idea of persuasive analogy and things like that. And anthropologists have done some very interesting work on it. But I hate with quite a burning passion this idea that you could use modern kind of tribal ideas to explain the ancient world because you think they're both more primitive, and that's something that's sort of snuck into anthropology a little bit originally. And I just think you've got to be very careful because you are comparing 21st century group to the ancient world. And I just think, are we comparing apples and oranges? But no, I really like that point, actually. I hadn't thought about it like within the Catholic Church. I kind of think a bit about the early church and the early church fathers, and I sort of wade into the cult of relics a bit with the kind of interactions with bits of the special dead and how we can use and how we find bits of the special dead used in curse tablets. But yeah, it's a really interesting point. Thank you. I really like that.
Yeah, I love that, paying attention to the language. That really invites a lot of nuance and subtlety in terms of our interpretation as well. Thank you so much. And Lauren, you also have your hand up.
I did. First of all, thank you so much. That was really every bit of it. I was really interested when you were talking about the sort of erotic from North Africa and Egypt, and also there being magical handbooks coming from Egypt. I'm a great lover of Homer, and so I'm thinking about Helen and her stay in Egypt and all the myths associating her there, and then the drugs that she's brought from Egypt that she ends up getting to use at the marriage and all that sort of thing. And I was just wondering, is there this sort of prevalent idea that might have weighed in the Homeric text that Egypt is this place where we have these sorts of tablets that are dealing with specifically either abducting women, or I'm thinking of Helen as being like the primary image of the abducted woman throughout, history, the ultimate lover that was abducted by Paris, or, that was seduced in some way through magical or, religious ways with Aphrodite's involvement and all that sort of thing. And I'm wondering if there is any sort of tradition, because I know Helen did have her own cult in Egypt, and there was a bit of a plane tree cult and some things dedicated to her. If that was something that was already in existence that's affecting the Homeric epics, or two, in this sort of a double-folded question, if there are any tablets that are, not necessarily somebody's individual personal thing, but that might actually be, shall we say, a later created relic that's invoking, something like with the abduction of Helen, something that might be referencing the myth in some way, rather than an actual personal cursed tablet. Sorry, it's
such a good question. My mind is like racing because there's a big problem with this, that people traditionally date all of the North African curse tablets to like the 1st century CE. And I'm currently working on something based on that very first curse tablet I showed you, that's 3rd century BCE. And it tends to get ignored because it's not in Greek or Latin. But I think there might be something here, because we get lots of kind of religious syncretism and these new sort of divine powers, sort of intermediary powers being invoked. And lots of the time it's a mixing of like Egyptian names with Greek names. And I think, and I'm not sure I could like pull together enough evidence yet to publish it, but I do think that there is this sense of Egypt as being potentially exotic with potentially dangerous elements. But I think that's probably influenced by Homer rather than the curse tablets influencing Homer, if that makes sense. I think the chronology is probably the Homeric myths come first, or the Homeric epics come first, and that shapes later ideas. I can't think of a single example that uses that myth of the abduction of Helen as like a kind of historiola in curses, but I would be entirely unsurprised if there was an amulet that included something like that as a kind of antidote to a possible curse, as Helen was abducted, protect me so I'm not abducted in the same way. Like I can totally see that being the case. But my knowledge of amulets is quite limited to Northern Europe. But I'm really interested in this idea. There's some really good work by, she's called Beth, I think she's actually Elizabeth Pollard, and she works on, she's just published really interesting, I just had the book out earlier, on kind of this idea of stalking and abduction and these erotic spells, and how all that kind of cultural milieu is working together, which is really interesting. But yeah, thank you. I'm gonna mull that over a bit more. So sorry that I haven't really answered it, but I need to think about it. It's so good.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much.
And
Thank
then
you.
Linda also had a question in the chat that I'm just seeing. Are there any incidences of standard rebuttal chucking the curse back? I'm thinking of the standard rebuttal to the threat of a gypsy curse. Curses are like chickens, they come home to roost.
What a good rebuttal. No, they tend to be, there's a couple that go off, anyone has cursed me, may they suffer the curse back, but there's not very many of them. So we've got about 2,000 published curse tablets, but we've just found, like, I don't know whether it's 2,000 or 3,000 more in a well in Athens. But, you know, a very small number are kind of this rebuttal. But it makes me wonder if there's a different ritual action that's undertaken to protect from curses, whether it's about having amulets on the body, amulets on the home, whether there's like purification rituals that would deal with that kind of potentially polluted nature that a curse tablet would bring about. Because I just think it's weird that there's this disconnect between how many curses we have, this idea that Pliny puts forward that everyone is scared of being cursed, and how little, there's no legal, like there's no legislation against it in ancient Athens, and they loved a court case, didn't they? So yeah, really interesting. So the basic answer to your question is no, I don't think so. So sorry. Again, a long answer. Sorry, Linda.
That's okay.
And thank you, Sarah, for all these really good bits of bibliography. I'm busily copying them down. Thank you.
Any other questions or thoughts?
Just one observation. The restless dead thing. It seems to have, the idea of the restless dead seems to have carried on. If you think about the ballet Giselle, that is the whole restless dead thing. These are girls who died before their marriage, who dance too much, is the thing that's normally left out. But they're all the restless dead.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there's a little bit of my chapter, there's a subchapter in my thesis that talks about this idea of like the restless dead and why they're special in the ancient world, and how those groups of being special carry on into the sort of medieval world. And I think you could carry it into the modern world. You know, we're still concerned by inappropriate levels of burial, aren't we? It's still like a cultural concern for us, because typically we view them as like having a malign power that could impact on our lives. So yeah, as you say, this is not just an ancient thing, but it's very interesting to me that the ancient Greeks specifically had these 4 categories that they sort of laid out, and they use these categories on curse tablets as well. So they use the specific terms. So they're like widely known in the ancient world that this is this particular group of a member of the restless dead belongs to, and I'm going to invoke them, or I'm going to invoke everybody but that belongs to that group, and this poor victim is going to suffer big time, which is also weird. So thank you. Yeah.
Anyone else? Alrighty then. Thank you so much, Charlotte. This was fantastic. I'm going to have, I will send out the recording if anybody wants to share it with anyone who wasn't able to make it today. And as well, I'll send out another link to Charlotte's slides. Thank you again 1,000 times for such a
Thank you
wonderful and
so
engaging
much.
talk.
Thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed it. Yeah. I'm sorry it's such a whistle-stop tour. It always is, because I'm like, have everything I love.
No, it's wonderful.
Your smile delete every kind of curse or dangerous.
Thank you.
That's worse.
Oh.
Thank you so much. And I hope to see you all again at a future talk.
Yep.
But in the meantime, have a wonderful Saturday.
And
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.